Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Should be pretty good. I'm gonna stop tracking my own audio because I've got like a 1 millisecond delay. That's it makes you talk slower. It's weird. Hopefully. Yeah, okay, so I can't hear myself now, which is quite nice. The stream starts in about 10 minutes or so, probably on the hour. But I figure get the microphone going. Hopefully that's coming through nice and clear. Turn that volume down a little bit on the music. I think I need to change this this Be Right Back screen because it's on a loop of like 5 tracks, and at most it's maybe 20 minutes. So if I leave this stream waiting for like an hour, odds are if you're waiting for an hour, you're going to hear the same song about 6 times. So 22:47 now, GMT, about 13 minutes or so, and then we'll crack on. Okay, so we're about 9 minutes away from the stream getting started. I don't know if anybody's in it yet. I know a few of you guys like to show up right at the end and kind of jump in just before we start, so if there's anybody there, you know, pop me a little message in the chat to say that you're here, and we'll greet each other like human beings for a change. Okay, we've got 2 minutes before everything kicks off. There isn't many of you in here at the minute, and in fact there's none of you in here at the minute, so it's probably going to be a bit one-sided today. If any of you pop in the meantime and you've got any questions, just let me know, but otherwise in a couple of minutes we'll just be kicking off anyway, and I'll go over what we're going to talk about and do a little brief intro of what's happening. Okay, welcome guys to our second kind of documentary stream on the channel. Welcome to the stream, first of all. We'll give it another 5 minutes or so for people to jump in, but in the meantime what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over what we're going to be talking about today and briefly cover the kind of topics that we're going to be looking at. This is actually a part one of a two-part thing, so I've broken down one of the documentaries into two different parts, and what's going to happen is that documentary is kind of comprised of lots of smaller videos, and I've already watched it. I've broken down those smaller videos and I've kind of covered a few gaps in information that they don't really give you. So what we'll do is we'll watch one or maybe two videos at a time, and then I will recap a little bit what they've been talking about and to provide some extra information, and I've prepped some images and stuff as well. So we'll be jumping between this screen and the actual video screen, so every time that the video comes to an end, it will jump back to me in a screen that looks like this, and I'll show some images and I'll talk about stuff. Today we're going to be going over a bit of Roman architecture and how that was based on the things that Rome needed to grow. So things that they needed for the administration of the city, for example. Quite a lot of talk about aqueducts and warehouses for food and stuff. You wanted some continuity to the streams last week, actually. A lot of the feedback last week said that, first of all, there wasn't a lot of us. It was a bit dry just watching straight up documentaries for an hour, and you guys wanted kind of our opinions on things, and you wanted kind of me to interject a little bit and talk about some extra stuff that they weren't really going on about. A lot of these documentaries, because they're open source, they can be quite old as well, and some of the information can be a little bit outdated or maybe incomplete, or maybe not really interesting enough for kind of a 21st century audience. This documentary in particular, it's got a very 90s feel to it, and you'll see that almost immediately in the first interview that goes on. So I'll be keeping track of any questions that come in. Obviously there's nobody here at the minute, but I've got my little notepad here, and I'll write down any questions that I see crop up, and whilst the video is playing and you guys are watching over that video, I'll be researching a accurate answer to those questions. I don't want to be giving you stuff that will lead you astray, so I'll be doing that confirmation whilst you're kind of engaged in the documentary. If I don't answer your questions straight away, I will eventually, so if you ask your question immediately before I'm due to kind of jump in, then expect to wait a little bit whilst I get the right answer to what you're asking. The stream actually should be about maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and like I say, this is a part one of a part two thing. The part two thing is probably not going to be next week, but it might be the week after. Next week, I was thinking of doing a restream of our Mythical Creatures bestiary. We have a new Mythical Creatures video coming out next week, and that's going to be part of that as well. So I appreciate you guys are probably a little bit far behind, but just in case there's anybody in there, is there any questions that you have before we get cracking on and start the stream? I'll leave it a minute or so, and then I'll jump back in, and then we'll get started on the first video. Right, okay, so there's no questions come in, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just explain how this is broken up for a second, and then we'll jump straight into the first video. So we're going to be watching the first video, and then there'll be a little bit of explanation. The first video is mostly talking about the kind of stonework that the Romans used to build their buildings. Then we're going to watch videos 2 and 3, which goes a little bit about a thing called the Porta Maggiore, which is kind of a gate in Rome that deals with aqueducts. So we'll go over 2 videos of that, and then we'll carry on the explanation. Then we'll do the 4th video, which kind of deals with Roman warehouses and the kind of stuff that passed through Roman warehouses, and we'll kind of provide some quotes and stuff as to the importance of that. And then finally on, well, not finally actually, on part 5 we've got a review of Ostia, and there's quite a bit of talk after that from us about the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is mentioned in the video. And then finally we've got videos 6 and 7, which kind of deals with people in Rome and how the population of Rome survived in such a dense environment. So we'll go over that, and we'll talk about some stuff at the end of that, and that'll be the end of part 1 of this stream. So without further ado, let's jump into video number 1 and go.
The splendidly evocative ruins of ancient Rome have long been a challenge to historians and archaeologists intent on reconstructing how that city once looked and functioned. During the imperial period, the city grew larger than any before in the Western world. How was the city constructed, and what were the materials used? How was it defended? How was the population supplied with food and water? How were the people housed and entertained? Above all, how did the Romans make the city work? This model shows how Rome might have looked during the reign of the Emperor Constantine. The population at its peak was probably 1 million, enormous by ancient standards, and 5 times that of Alexandria, the next largest city in the Roman Empire. Meeting even the basic needs of such a population, let alone the construction of monumental public buildings, surely required considerable engineering and organisational ability. Yet the Romans themselves have the reputation of contributing nothing of note to the history of technology. By this account, they were completely uninventive. All they did was appropriate the innovations of the peoples they conquered. How can we reconcile these two judgments? The ancient history of Rome lasted some 1,000 years, from the time they were ruled by kings, through the Republican period, which lasted some 4 centuries, and then into the Empire, when Rome reached the height of its power. It's necessary to consider these issues in the context of Rome's physical development. The geographical setting combines fertile land with ready access to the sea by means of the river Tiber. Equally vital was high ground for defensive purposes, the famous 7 Hills of Rome. As the city expanded into the valleys, the marshy ground between the hills was drained by channeling an existing stream into the river Tiber. This became Rome's main sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, still in use 9 centuries later during the reign of Constantine. Indeed, it is still in use today, despite modern landfill on the banks of the Tiber. The first stone defences were built in the early Republican era, the so-called Serbian Wall. They were carefully constructed with a locally quarried material, called tufa, a softish sedimentary volcanic ash. Easy to quarry, it continued to be used in the imperial period, even after concrete became the main building material.
Although we tend to think about Roman construction of the imperial period in terms of concrete, there was in fact a viable alternative, which was very much used in the earlier Republican period. And this is the use of large squared blocks of tufa, as we have here. The use of these large tufa blocks continued, in fact, for some particular functions, usually large public buildings, right into the middle of the 1st century and beyond. Notice how fine the joints are between the stones. This means that work has to take place both at the quarry and on site, whereas concrete requires far less skilled labour.
Stone was also used to replace wood for building bridges. Stone arches were necessary to span the river, as in the Pons Cestius, built during the late Republic and then replaced in the imperial period. The facing material of the later bridge was travertine, another local stone. This bridge has been rebuilt several times, but it still serves its original function, connecting the right bank of the river with the Tiber Island. Another important masonry structure is the Porta Maggiore, built in the early imperial period. This monumental double arch is also constructed with travertine, a kind of limestone from nearby Tivoli. Travertine, a much harder material than tufa, but more difficult to quarry, was used increasingly in early imperial buildings. Beneath the Porta Maggiore survives a portion of road. Like all major roads in the vicinity of Rome, it was paved with basalt, a very durable local volcanic rock. Even in this, deep ruts were worn by the constant traffic of wheeled carts.
Okay, so that video kind of covered the building materials that Romans used when they were kind of creating their city. So they used tufa and travertine and a reddish brick, which made up most of their kind of construction. This is going to come up quite a bit later on for Roman housing, actually, the red bricks. But the main problem is that Roman builders and officials, they wanted something grandiose, but they also wanted something really cheap. And the problem with using something like marble, for example, is it's pretty expensive. And when it's used, it's usually just for surface decoration. Most of the stuff underneath is just travertine, tufa, and these bricks. Tufa and travertine are both limestone, which is relatively easy to carve up. So the masons didn't really have to do that much work to get it done. And they're easier to carve up than, say, marble or granite. Travertine's a bit harder, but you know, it's still a limestone, so it doesn't really have that many issues. I've got a quote here from Vitruvius on architecture in Rome, and he says, "Efficiency, however, is the appropriate arrangement of resources and of the site, and the moderation of expense in the work by means of thrifty reasoning. This will be attended to if in the first place the architect does not require what cannot be found or prepared only at great expense. For it is not everywhere that there is a supply of quarry and sand or stone, or fir wood or pine or marble, but each thing is found in a different location, and their transportation can be difficult. Vitruvius is basically saying, pay attention to what you're buying, because supply and demand is a cruel, cruel mistress. In reference to the power of the emperor, actually, in last week's stream there was quite a lot of talk of how the image and the monuments of the emperor kind of represented his power. Stuff like granite obelisks, because they weren't made of tufa or travertine or regular Roman building materials, they were very clearly representations of the emperor's power. Mostly because of how expensive it would have been to import it, and the logistics it would have taken would have required a lot of power. On the side of buildings, originally carvings and the like were made of carved wood, but travertine quarries were opened up later because travertine is, first of all, it's a brilliant white, and the Romans loved to kind of make themselves look grandiose and kind of illuminated, and it's also, from a masonry point of view, it provides a crisp edge for a long time that doesn't rot, and just like wood, it's fairly inexpensive. Okay, so let's continue on to the second and third videos.
The Porta Maggiore carried two major aqueducts. Here we see the Anio Novus stacked on top of the Aqua Claudia. Together, these great aqueducts doubled Rome's water supply. The Porta Maggiore is situated close to the point where 5 aqueducts entered the city. They were part of a complex system of water supply developed from the early Republican period, when the city outgrew its local springs. The water was brought in from distant hills. The system of aqueducts was a major engineering achievement, not only of construction, but of surveying, as each aqueduct followed a gentle incline across irregular territory, carried on arcades or in underground channels, depending on the contours of the land. The model shows a branch of the Aqua Claudia snaking around existing buildings to supply the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. The strength and versatility of concrete, faced with masonry or brick, was particularly suited to the construction of the large arches needed to carry the aqueducts through the city. Some of the brick-faced concrete arcades adjoining the Porta Maggiore still exist, intersecting the remains of another defensive wall. Towards the end of the imperial period, the renewed threat of barbarian invasion led to the rapid construction of the second fortification ring in the history of ancient Rome, the Aurelianic Wall. Attached to one of the 4 main gateways, the Porta Appia, a stretch of this wall survives. There were projecting square towers at regular intervals, built of brick-faced concrete. The walls were more than 6 metres high, and some 4 metres thick, far more substantial than the old Serbian Wall. By the time the new walls were built, concrete building technology was well established. On the inside of the walls, arches carried an interior vaulted gallery, above which ran a battlemented wall walk. The walls were not only tall enough and thick enough to withstand the siege weapons of the time, they were also designed to maximise movement and communication on the inside, along the 19 kilometres of wall surrounding the city.
Okay, so he talked quite a lot there about aqueducts and the Porta Maggiore, actually, which is this one. So, just going back a little bit about the Porta Maggiore, it was originally known as the Porta Prenestina, and in Rome it's apparently the best place to go if you want to understand Roman aqueducts. The name change was probably due to where the modern day structure sits in relation to other Roman districts around. The Maggiore is similar to a name of a area nearby. the Porta Maggiore started off as simply a bridge for aqueducts. It was kind of like a fancy face for a fairly routine structure. And later on, Emperor Aurelian, when he was building his wall, he recycled the aqueducts and Porta Maggiore for that wall. He turned Porta Maggiore into an actual gate. So Porta is kind of like, it means gate, essentially. But at the time, when it was first built, it wasn't really a gate. It was just kind of a fancy kind of grandiose structure that a lot of people put their names on to make themselves seem impressive. But eventually, when they built this wall, they recycled a lot of the aqueducts and the Porta Maggiore to an actual wall and an actual gate instead of just a symbolic thing. Anyway, next video.
During the 6 centuries and more which separated the building of the Servian and Aurelianic walls, the city had expanded to an unprecedented size. Rome was a magnet for the peoples of its empire, who crammed into the areas between its great public buildings and spaces. Somehow all these people had to be housed and fed. To meet the gargantuan appetite of the capital, shiploads of grain, the main staple of the Roman diet, were brought in from the provinces. The grain was brought into the capital by barges which had to be towed up the river Tiber. Some of the grain was stored in purpose-built vaulted warehouses, or horea, in the riverside area known as the Emporium. The Tiber could not be navigated by the large sea-going cargo ships laden with grain from Sicily, Sardinia and North Africa. As a result, Ostia, some 30 kilometres down the Tiber, became the capital's main port from the time of the late Republic onwards.
Okay, so it's important to first say that Roman warehouses didn't just store grain. They also didn't just store food. Inside these places, there'd also be things like olive oil, there'd be wine, there'd be marble and other stone imports, and a lot of other trade items. There were about 300 warehouses in Rome at the time of Aurelian, and the largest was gigantic. It was enormous. I've got some research on the biggest one actually, and it contained 140 rooms on the ground floor alone, and covered an area of about 225,000 square feet. So just for context, actually, 65% of warehouses in the US are around 25,000 square feet in size. So the biggest one in Rome was about 10 times the size of a modern-day regular warehouse. The name Horea became synonymous with just general storehouses eventually, applying to things like Horea Subterranea, which were kind of like cellars. There was a... So this is kind of what they look like. I've got a quote here from a guy called William J. Bernstein, and he says, "Although the modern image of the imperial city is dominated by the ruins of the Colosseum and the Forum, the economic life of ancient Rome centered on side streets filled with apartments, shops, and Horea." The amount of stuff that passed through these warehouses was absolutely insane. There's actually an artificial island, an artificial mountain, should I say, in Rome called Mount Testaccio, and it looks like this. And it's entirely made of broken pieces of olive oil pottery from a nearby Horea. And this is how big it is, actually. Let me just find the image for this. It's completely comprised of pottery. And for context of how much pottery is in there, the mound is suspected to hold enough pottery that would match about 6 billion litres of olive oil. So just think for a second about the manic nature of those warehouses and how many people would need to be there to just manage them and administrate them, to guard them even, and to help them to protect them from pests and hazards like fires and theft. So it was a huge deal in Rome. Let's carry on.
Ostia became one of the largest provincial cities of the empire, with a population estimated at between 20 and 40,000. Many buildings have been excavated, mainly from the imperial period, and are fully representative of the kind of brick-faced concrete architecture practiced in the capital itself at that time. This model of Ostia gives some idea of just how built up the ancient settlement probably was. The importance of river trade is apparent in the density of riverside building and in the city's lateral spread. The layout of the centre is quite typical of the planned provincial Roman city. There were two main streets. The Decumanus Maximus ran parallel with the river in an east-west direction, and the north-south Cardo Maximus intersected it at the Forum. The Decumanus Maximus was typically paved with blocks of volcanic basalt. An imposing brick and concrete temple, the Capitolium, was added to the Forum, which was rebuilt during the 2nd century in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. Later that century, the Forum baths were added nearby. These were the largest of the 3 public baths at Ostia. They were built during the reign of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. The large window frames and the marble columns which survive among the concrete residue hint at their former splendour. The clustering of warehouses on the riverfront at the north of the city reflects the central importance of shipping and grain for Ostia. There is further evidence of its importance at the Piazza of the Corporations, an urban space dominated by the city's theatre. Originally, the theatre was built at the very start of the imperial period under Augustus. In front of the theatre is the so-called Piazza of the Corporations, which had a double colonnaded portico on 3 sides. There is some dispute about the piazza's function. Either traders conducted business here, or they paid for the portico's refurbishment. Whatever its function, there are a number of black and white mosaic pavements in front of the colonnade's small rooms, from which much can be inferred about the system of trade in the Roman Empire, and in particular about the capital's grain supply. The modius, a container for measuring grain, is a common motif in the mosaics. Above this modius is a regular for levelling off the grain, thus ensuring a standard measure for accounting purposes. The overseas origins of many of the traders are frequently indicated. Sometimes this is by an inscription, here from the ship owners of Carthage, the most important port and trading centre of North Africa, one of Rome's richest sources of grain. This elephant could represent trade in ivory, or the import of animals for use in imperial processions. Here is a sea-going merchant ship with a dolphin on its side. A storage jar, probably containing olive oil or wine, is being carried to a riverboat with steering oars. Between these 2 boats is the distinctive stepped structure of the nearby Claudian lighthouse, based on that of the renowned Pharos lighthouse at Alexandria. The increasing traffic of large ships led to the construction by the Emperor Claudius of a large artificial harbour and canal at Porta, on the other side of the Tiber from Ostia. This was followed by an inner hexagonal harbour and new canal built in the 2nd century during the reign of Trajan. These facilities meant that Porta increasingly replaced Ostia for the shipment of grain to the capital. This artificial harbour was a prime example of Roman ingenuity with concrete, exploiting its capacity to set under water. The importance and activity of the harbour can be judged from this marble relief, showing, amongst other symbolic imagery, the Claudian lighthouse behind the sail of the ship in the foreground.
Okay, so there was quite a lot of information in that video, and there's a couple of key points that I want to talk about to provide a little bit more information, actually. But there's so much other stuff that I could talk about. These are just a couple of things that kind of stood out to me. So first of all, you've got the Capitolium, which was the temple early on in the video. And it was the largest temple in Ostia. And the ruin for it is actually bigger than every other ruin in the city because it sits on a raised podium. So it looks a hell of a lot more prominent than anything else that you see there today. It sits on the cross between the two main streets that were talked about in the video. And it was dedicated to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, or Zeus, Hera, and Athena in Greek mythology. These were also called the Capitolian Triad, which is where the Capitolium gets its name. Something interesting about this is that it kind of lends a lot of light to the culture of the people that lived in Ostia at the time. So when they originally discovered this Capitolium, they thought it was actually dedicated to the god Vulcan, because there was evidence of a large Vulcan cult in Ostia, and it wasn't until archaeologists eventually found a plaque that had the Capitolian Triad on it that the correct dedication was kind of discovered. There was also a mention to the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is this image here, and it was also called the Pharos Lighthouse. And Pharos was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And it was a few 100 feet high. It was clearly something that people were in awe over, and they wanted to replicate by the lighthouse that was nearby to the port that was just mentioned in the video. And that kind of makes sense because it was, at the time, it was one of the tallest structures in the world. So imagine seeing something that huge when everything else is just minuscule in comparison. And it would really stick with you, and you'd want to replicate that kind of sense of awe to the people that come to your city. The lighthouse survived for an extremely long time, and it wasn't until a series of earthquakes hit it that it actually fell to ruin, and some of it fell into the sea as well. And there's still quite a few of the bricks and structures of the lighthouse underwater in the sea to where it used to be. And some of the bricks were actually kind of ferried away from it and wound up in the building of the citadel of Kite Bay nearby. So there's like a castle fort in Alexandria, which is built with some of the bricks that were kind of recyclable from the lighthouse's collapse. Actually, in 2016, Egypt said it planned to open an underwater museum, showing off some of the submerged ruins that were in the water where it used to be. So if you ever end up in Egypt, I guess, maybe something worth thinking about. Here's a quote from a Ibn Jubayr about the lighthouse when it was actually there and what he thought of it at the time. So he says, "One of the greatest wonders that we saw in this city was the lighthouse which the great and glorious God had erected by the hands of those who were forced to such labour as a sign to those who take warning from examining the fates of others, and as a guide to voyagers, for without it they could not find the true course to Alexandria. It can be seen for more than 70 miles and is of great antiquity. It is mostly strong built in all directions and competes with the skies in height. Description of it falls short, and the eyes fail to comprehend it. The words are inadequate, so vast is the spectacle." So just something to think about. I guess if you've never seen a skyscraper before in your life, which is what this kind of technically was, and then you see a skyscraper, it's going to kind of blow your mind. So yeah, let's carry on with the next video.
As well as being shipped to Rome, grain was stored in warehouses at Porta and at Ostia, which remained the administrative centre. An imposing example of a grain warehouse at Ostia is the Grand Horea, first built during the reign of Claudius and later much enlarged. Grain warehouses had raised internal floors to protect the product from damp and vermin. Not all of the Horea at Porta and Ostia were granaries. This striking example of a warehouse complex in Ostia, the tongue-twistingly named Horea Epigathiana et Epaphroditiana, was probably built by 2 freed slaves for the storage of wholesale luxury goods. According to one expert on Ostia, the warehouse combined elegance and utility to a remarkable degree, although only the ground floor survives. A product of the 2nd century Ostian building boom, it was a major capital investment, as the mosaic courtyard shows. Mosaics were an expensive embellishment signifying successful commercial concern. The entrance consisted of an inner as well as an outer doorway, as security was evidently a prime consideration in the building plan. The structure as a whole was brick-faced concrete, and the design makes full use of the arches and vaulting the material facilitated. Here, an exposed cross vault. There were 16 large rooms on the ground floor, opening onto the courtyard, and at least 2 stories above. Multi-storied buildings like this were also necessary to house the majority of the population of Ostia and Rome.
Rome, as far as we can tell, was the largest city in the Western world until the very late 18th and early 19th century, London and Paris. Before the days of modern transportation, the distance that anybody could live from where they worked, from the political centre, from the economic centre, was dictated by how far you could walk in a reasonably short time. In Rome itself, certainly, carts, which would seem an obvious alternative, were banned from the city during the day. They were only allowed in at night, with the exception of builders' carts. So that the population on the whole, unless they could afford a horse or a mule, had to go by foot. And I think this is the fundamental restriction on the horizontal spread. So that if you then increase the population, you need to go up. This reconstruction shows a 5-storey building, the kind where most people in Rome and Ostia would have lived. They are often referred to as insulae or islands, which basically means a city block bounded by 4 streets, although an insula can also mean an individual unit in the block.
What remains of these buildings is usually the first 2 stories, where the wealthiest residents lived. The further up the building, the smaller the apartments and the poorer the occupants. This social structure is the reverse of the modern apartment block. Water was only supplied at ground floor level, if at all. This is the insula of Jove and Ganymede, one of the many to have been excavated at Ostia.
The insulae that we have at Ostia, and the very few examples of Rome, are all built out of concrete. Now, Roman concrete develops in a slightly different way to modern concrete, in that the basic building material are fist-sized pieces of stone, usually the soft volcanic stone called tufa, bonded together with a mortar made out of lime and pozzolana. And it's the pozzolana, a volcanic product, which gives Roman concrete its great strength. It has properties very similar to modern Portland cement, in that it sets underwater. The walls are built with 2 faces and a core, and the facing in Ostia and Rome in the imperial period is mainly of brick, very thin bricks, a very typical material that you see everywhere around you in Ostia. The brick is often combined with opus reticulatum, which are small pieces of tufa cut into squares but set diagonally, forming a network pattern. The brick and concrete arched lintels over this double doorway in the interior of the insula of Jove and Ganymede were a standard feature of insular construction. Exterior brick facings were often exposed, although the brickwork and opus reticulatum on the inside was covered with plaster, a trace of which remains. The wall is constructed in 2 phases, with a facing which is brick with fairly narrow mortar joints, and the core itself. As far as we can see, the wall is built up in perhaps 10 to 12 courses of brick, and the core is then laid between these 2 faces. And then we start again with the brick. The narrower mortar joints in the facing allow this to dry and develop strength more quickly than the core. This allows the whole wall to go up fairly fast in stages. In some ways, building a Roman wall is far more like building a modern brick wall than building a modern concrete structure. Inside the building, stone corbels supported wooden floors. The wooden beams were bedded in holes in the walls, in line with the corbels. Although little direct evidence of floor and roof structures survive, Roman carpentering skills were of the highest order. One of the joys of the Ostian insulae is that they're sufficiently well preserved to give us quite a good idea of how people actually lived in these buildings on a day-to-day basis. The large windows that you find everywhere and the fragments of window glass which have come out of the excavations suggest that glazing was quite common. We know, in fact, from some bath buildings that the Romans even knew about double glazing and the thermal properties of it.
The holes in the stone upright held glazing bars, which were doubled up around the hottest rooms.
Okay, so that was the last couple of videos for us to watch. I'll just go over some information now about those two. So, first of all, you've got insulae, and they were talking about the idea of having to walk to work, and the insulae commonly had storefronts and places of business on the ground floors, which would have helped in that regard. Here's an image, actually. So at the bottom, where you can see the doorways, you would have staircases to get to the insula, which were the apartments, and you would have kind of storefronts that people could work in. People commonly lived from the first floor upwards, and with the lower of those floors were more for like affable people. So they had better access to water. You know, you didn't have to go as far to get to the ground floor if there was an emergency, that kind of thing. As far as social class goes, this is probably just my opinion on this, actually, but I feel like the idea of poor people being confined upstairs also stopped a lot of unwanted social interaction between the rich and the poor. So there was a lot less bumping into each other on the stairs, basically, to get from one to another. The reason I'm saying that is that Rome was kind of a very class-based prejudiced system, and it seems awfully familiar to modern-day kind of executive entrances to apartment blocks, where the rich have their own way in so they don't have to interact with the non-rich. Like I said, that's just my opinion on that. Insulae, another one. So here's a kind of an inside look. I'll just make this a little bit bigger. So you can see at the bottom there's some storefronts, and there's the floor above that's got its own kind of balcony for the more rich people to enjoy the outdoors a little bit, I guess. There could be upwards of 9 floors to these blocks. There was a bit of regulation by the Roman state to make them only have a maximum of about 5 or 6 floors, but there were some places where that got a lot higher. But obviously the taller these buildings get, the less safe they are, the less structurally sound they are. So they were kind of regulated to be a certain size because they knew it stopped getting safe after a certain point. These usually had 6 apartments, which were the insula. And many of them have been lost to time, actually. There's only one of them still standing in all of Rome, actually. And there was thousands and thousands of them at the time. So they weren't built to last as much as kind of the stone monuments like the bridges and the Colosseum. But they did what they were meant to do at the time. The top floors, actually, just as a kind of add-on to the poor, the top floors were usually less safe than the bottom floors. They were more susceptible to fires, they were less maintained, and for that reason they were smaller and usually cheaper as well, which is probably why the poor ended up there. And in terms of safety as well, the insulae were very, very susceptible to fires, so a lot of them burned down. And to try and prevent fires, and even things like burglary, the walls of the insulae became thicker and thicker over time, and things like the windows were raised to a height above person level so that it was harder to break in and steal all of the things from the market stalls and the shops below. So yeah, that's it. That's the end of part 1 of this Roman look into Roman construction and its effects, and the kind of purpose of things from an administrative point of view, I guess. From you've got to keep the city going, so how do you do that? You know, you build huge warehouses, you make another city nearby be able to provide you with quicker access to supplies, you build apartment blocks. Yeah, the top was kind of a tenement type building, yeah, like you say. They built like apartment blocks so they could fit a lot of people into a small space. They built loads of aqueducts so they could feed the city with water so that nobody kind of dehydrated in the Italian heat. And they provided security, so they had one section of walls and then they built another section of walls, and they expanded outwards by recycling as well some of the things that maybe they didn't need anymore, or some of the things that they could convert to other purposes. So aqueducts also becoming walls, for example. So yeah, next week actually we're not going to be doing mythical creatures. We're not going to be doing Roman construction part 2. We're going to be doing a mythical creatures video. When the Romans left England, why do you think we just abandoned all the settlements the Romans had built and all of the technology? So I'm probably not educated enough to answer this kind of question. I would suspect that when the Romans left, a lot of the stuff was either made out of materials that weren't long-lasting, or they were repurposed for other things. I remember actually I went to York Cathedral, and they said that a lot of Vikings came in, a lot of people kind of invaded York because it was a perfect place, perfect position to encamp and build an empire, basically. And where York Cathedral used to stand, there was a massive Roman military encampment where a lot of people were based, that was eventually abandoned as Rome left. And the Normans came in and the Vikings came in, and the Vikings at the time were kind of just embracing Christianity, and they built the first version of York Cathedral. And to basically stick 2 fingers up to the Roman Empire, they plopped it right on top of this military encampment, this military building. They demolished a section of it and they built it right on top. And we know they did it for kind of antagonistic reasons, because the Romans really loved straight lines. They really loved like north to south, east to west straight lines. So this encampment that they built, this kind of military structure, was a big square that was perfectly aligned with north, south, east, west. And then the Vikings came in and then they just shoved it at a random angle on top of this military encampment because they knew that the Romans would hate it. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, that for lots of different places, I think they have different reasonings for different things. In the case of York, it was to show their power for an empire that was still kind of ongoing in the distance. And to kind of show the people that they were in charge. You know, this thing that's been standing for so long, that's kind of a symbol of military might, we're going to come in and we're going to completely deface the whole thing. So I reckon there's quite a few reasons for a lot of different Roman places. Maybe some things fell into disrepair, maybe some things were built out of wood, so they just collapsed over time. Maybe some things, they didn't have the materials anymore. You know, there was an episode of, I hate to say it, Time Team, where they were looking at a kind of an old mill, and the mill was abandoned basically because the river just stopped running. The river changed course and went somewhere else, so the entire structure was just abandoned and was moved somewhere else. Yeah, so York Cathedral's been built up over time. The Romans, the Roman and the Viking stuff. If you go into York Cathedral, you can go into the basement, and there's a glass floor, and you can see all of the original architecture from the original cathedral, and there's a huge timeline of the Vikings. Any other questions, I guess? Any other questions at all? I'm an open book. Sure, you guys have a think. I'm going to go on to the Be Right Back for a second and get myself a drink. You guys do what you do, and I will be back in about 5 minutes. Hey, so that was a lot quicker than I expected it to be. Okay, so recommend a book on Roman history. I have a book actually by a guy called Robert Graves, and he did Greek mythology. A lot of the Heracles stuff is based on his interpretations of the Greek myths, and he's very, very good at what he does. I know that he wrote another book about Emperor Claudius, I think it was. And just from experience from reading his book about the Greek myths, I would say that that's something that you could definitely look into. For example, the Greek myth stuff, he's the only person that I've seen that actually has answers to some of the more complicated questions, such as the old names for cities. And for example, like Heracles will go to a place, and some other places will just be like, he went to a place, he dealt with this king, the end. Whereas Robert Graves, he goes into a lot of detail about what that place was called, where it was, how many people kind of lived there. So I recommend, if you're gonna look at ancient Roman thing, I know that he wrote one about Claudius. I've not read it myself, but just from, I guess, from reputation, I would say that it's something that I would definitely consider. The classical music is there, it's just on very, very quiet. If you want me to turn it up, I can. If you don't want it on, I can turn it down. It's actually been there the whole time. While I've been talking over in my voiceover stuff, it's kind of been sat in the background, just doing its thing. What is your favorite period in history, and what is your favorite moment from history? Ah, that's a really tough one. I find that a lot of my videos go back to Italy, and I reckon most of that is because the Roman Empire went on for so long and it affected so many things. I think probably ancient Rome, and the reason I say that is because a lot of the big kind of important stories happened in ancient Rome. a lot of cultural stories. You know, you've got the story of Spartacus. That's an ancient Roman Italian story. You've got Dante. Dante is an Italian guy, and he based his work on Virgil. Virgil was an Italian guy. And a lot of the ancient Greek stories as well, because it was Greco-Roman, a lot of the ancient Greek stories kind of parallel with the ancient Roman stories a lot. And with ancient Rome, you can have these more classical dramatic things like gladiators, gladiator battles, this kind of fight for your freedom. It's tricky because at the same time I really like the stories about, because I'm English obviously, so I really enjoy the stories about English history, not so much recent history, but more Anglo-Saxon, and how the country was split up into so many different parts and how that kind of merged together over time and became what it is today. That's really super interesting. There's a couple of videos on YouTube actually that I've been watching which do every single year of British history, but it just shows the borders and it shows how the structure of Britain changed over the last 1,000 years or so. Plans on doing videos for Paradiso. So the next series would be Purgatorio. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish up Heracles. We've got Heracles 10 coming out tomorrow, which has been on the Patreon for a day or so. There should be 3 more episodes on that. So episode 10 will be 9th Labour. There's 12 labours. So yeah, it'll be 3 more episodes of Heracles. And then if Metasoma's back from his kind of personal retreat, then we'll get back on it. Metasoma's the guy that does the voice of Virgil, so we can't really start Purgatorio until he comes back. Unfortunately, something personal happened and he had to kind of step away from the channel for a little while, so that's why you've not been hearing him very much. And Steel Stash has been taking up a few more episodes, which Metasoma would have originally covered. Actually, not tomorrow, but the week after, we've got an artist who's doing some artwork for our new Mythical Creatures video. It's not going to be a very long video. It's probably going to be about 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes. But he's done a couple of pieces of artwork for us to put in there. And he's going to, hopefully for the videos moving forward, he's going to be providing some artwork for some of the videos that we're doing. After Purgatorio, we'll obviously get into Paradiso, but that's way down the line. Purgatorio is probably going to cover us up until maybe October-ish. So in terms of the stream, next week, like I said, we're not going to go on to part 2 of this. We're going to be doing a rewatch of the Mythical Creatures. So we've got, I think, something like 15 Mythical Creatures videos now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break that down like I've done this one and essentially watch each one by one and then cover some extra information that wasn't in the video itself to basically mix it up a little bit. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we did in Inferno that that covered a lot of history, but there was a lot that we didn't actually cover, and it wasn't because we didn't want to. It's because we didn't really have time. I mean, there was loads of things about, say, the fact that Dante was not homophobic, which was kind of strange for the time. There's stuff like, for example, when he's talking to his mentor, which is Capitolium, I believe, he references him very respectfully, even though Capitolio's a sodomite. There's people in the realm of the lustful that are homosexuals, and the fact that they're only in the second circle says that Dante didn't really care about it very much. So there's loads of stuff like that we could have put in there, but it was more kind of time constraints and context. I did have an idea the other day to maybe do some kind of podcast of the stuff that we missed in Inferno before we do Purgatorio. So we kind of do a recap of Inferno, and then at the end just do kind of a round table of other stuff. But yeah, I think we did all right in Inferno. There was a point around episode 7 or so that we stopped coming up with ideas for topics. It wasn't because we didn't have anything to talk about. There's a lot of stuff to talk about. Yeah, it takes a lot of time to research it all. Yeah. So it wasn't that we couldn't come up with topics of discussion. Is that we couldn't come up with topics of discussion that were big enough for its own video. So for the first few episodes, we talked about Dante's history, we talked about Virgil, we talked about how it affected the modern day, and eventually we got to the point where we don't have a topic big enough to put at the start of a video and then tie that video into the topic of discussion. So the idea is cut off the history lessons for a while, save some of them for Purgatorio, and then we could do the same thing in Purgatorio where we have a few episodes where we're covering a little bit more history stuff. There's quite a lot of planning to this, actually. Behind the scenes, there's a lot of discussions and talks that I guess you guys aren't really exposed to about the way that things are going to move forward and the decisions that we're going to make. I mean, all this stuff to do with the Patreon stuff. We have to make decisions on whether or not we should look at some kind of community funding situation, or maybe advertisements on the videos, or even partnerships. And the consensus was that if we do stuff like Patreon, then at least we're rewarding the people that watch the videos for watching the videos and supporting us. Whereas adverts are very detrimental, especially for an education channel. You don't want to be having to sit and watch adverts and sponsorships and stuff when you're just there to be educated. So any other questions about anything, really? I'm happy to keep going for a little while. Yeah, multi-channel networks with is a no-no, because from research they literally do nothing for you other than take a percentage of what you earn, and maybe provide you access to audio libraries, which we've already got. So yeah, don't worry about that. We won't be joining any MCNs. Self-studying. So the channel's been going since May last year, and before that, probably maybe 6 months before that as well. It's difficult to gauge, because when you've got a passion, you learn about it all the time. So yeah, an MCN just to get a thumbnail. Yeah. Some of the percentages that some of them want are ridiculous. Some of them, sometimes it's 25%, 30%, and you're thinking to yourself, how can you justify that? All right. I guess if there's no other topics of discussion, I don't think I've missed anything. I've got a list of stuff that I needed to go over. Yeah, actually, what do you think about? You did an education in this direction? Actually, my education was in computer science. I'm educated as a programmer, and I'm a software engineer by trade. So all of this is literally passion projects. It's a bit weird, really, because I'm trying to obviously provide this kind of this thing where I talk about interesting subjects, but I'm not a paid professional in the field. So sometimes it kind of feels like I'm kind of half faking it, but I'm not. I'm spending a lot of time researching the subjects and stuff. So hopefully it comes across that I know what I'm talking about, because that's probably the key piece of information. The thing I quite like about these streams actually is that it's a lot more informal. That you guys can ask me questions and I can just talk. One of the problems with the videos that we do every week, they're very highly scripted. Say you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, but you also don't want to provide false information. So, for example, there's been quite a few times where we've been making the videos where some of the script has just been torn out because we've come across a reference which just totally obliterates all of the information that we've been writing up. So we'll write a script and there'll be a whole thing about Heracles, for example, or Dante, and we'll get about 3/4 of the way through the script, and then we'll read a passage that basically just wipes out part of the other script. So there's a lot of research that goes into it to make sure it's as accurate as possible. One of the biggest issues we have is names of things. So if there's an Italian name, or if there's a Greek name, or if there's something like a name of a city that hasn't been spoken of in the last 20 years, it's kind of difficult to find pronunciation for that. So we do have to kind of make up names a little bit to what we think they sound like. In the Heracles one tomorrow, there's a bit actually where I keep calling the Amazons the Amazonians just as a slip, and I didn't realize until the end of the editing. So tomorrow you'll hear that. I'd say that if you research the things you talk about, the knowledge would be the same as a formal education. Yeah, I mean that's the same in any trade. I went to university to do computer science, but you could learn everything that I know from online modules and stuff. And that's something you only realize after you've got the education already, that you could have done it yourself. So anyway, yeah, what was I saying? Hopefully this stream's been a lot better than last week. A lot more interesting, maybe. You guys wanted there to be more talking. You wanted there to be more interaction and basically more streamy stuff going on. What language did I write in? My, well, programmer, it doesn't really matter, but my first language was Visual Basic 6 on Visual Studio, and then it was Java, then it was Python. Yeah, the list goes on. Cool. Like I said, next week is going to be mythical creatures, so we'll have a break from this. The issue that we've got with OpenLearn at the minute is that there's not that many resources about ancient Rome, so there's a lot of picking up of videos and seeing if they can work with the kind of story that we're trying to tell. Yeah, there's a bit of a delay. There's probably a 20-30 second delay. That's just a context of that's problem with streaming, I guess. Okay, I think we've been going for about an hour now, so if there's anything else, drop me a line and I will reply to you. Just shove it in a comment in the stream when the stream's done. It will go into the playlist where the last one did, and hopefully this time I won't get a bunch of copyright strikes like I did last week on the Creative Commons content, because YouTube Content ID is bananas. And yeah, glad you liked it this week compared to last week, and thanks for stopping in. I guess I'll see you next week. My regulars, my 2 regulars in the chat. No worries. I'll see you next time. Toodles.